revolution.
Graduation day at the famed University of Princeton, USA. Recently, its hallowed halls were scandalized by the research of Dr. Robert Jahn, one of Princeton's most senior academics. Dean of the Faculty of Engineering for 15 whole years, in 1986, the university authorities forced Jahn to resign, demoting him to mere professor. What was his crime?
Universitatis Princetoniensis commissa, vosat gradum primum in artibus.
The university refuses to comment, as do virtually all Jahn's colleagues.
Well, the university is slightly embarrassed, more embarrassed when he was dean, and now he's just a professor. But people recognize that he did some very good engineering work, so that's one of the reasons that I'm sure that he's still around and allowed to do what he likes. But he wouldn't get tenure now as an assistant professor if this was on the strength of what he does now.
Frontier research into deep space rocketry is what originally made Jahn's name, and the university is proud of his record. But they'd rather forget the other research that created such a scandal. Jahn himself is equally proud of both.
For the past 30 years or so, I have been directing this electric propulsion laboratory. My students, my colleagues, and I have been performing research on plasma propulsion systems that one day will propel very large spacecraft on manned Mars missions. But I would also like to share with you somewhat different, perhaps even more unusual research interest that I've developed.
And it's that research, hidden away in a basement, that cost him his job. His crime was to found a laboratory to investigate the extrasensory powers of the human mind. Once forbidden to show it publicly, he's now glad to receive visitors.
Hi there. Welcome to our PAIR laboratory. PAIR is an acronym for Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research. And the lab we're going to walk through here has been in existence about 14 years now. Come on in. As you can see, it's a rather modest laboratory that was actually put together out of some dead storage space we had here in the University Engineering School. It combines the requisite scientific and technological sophistication with a rather unusual informal ambiance that we find very important in the conduct of our experiments. Here you will notice one of our principal pieces of equipment called random mechanical cascade. Basically, it takes some 9,000 marbles and allows them to trickle through that array of pegs, and the effort of the operator, who is seated on this comfortable couch, is to shift that distribution to the right or to the left in accordance with pre-stated intentions. Brenda Dunn is our laboratory manager who coordinates all of these experimental laboratories. Here we have the prototypical random event generator experiment that really has served as our benchmark facility. This experiment has the purpose of seeing whether the human mind can influence a very sophisticated electronic machine.
It may sound high-tech, but however sophisticated, the whole idea of psychic research for most scientists is highly questionable, as indeed it was once for Jahn himself. He only got involved in it by accident.
A very good undergraduate student in the school came to me with a research proposal to study experimentally the interaction of the human mind with a simple microelectronic device. And whereas I found it very unlikely, nonetheless it seemed perfectly reasonable to let the student try the study. And it all began there.
For the undergraduate thesis, a senior engineering school technician constructed a device to detect psychokinesis, so-called mind over matter. Made of standard electronic components, at its heart is an off-the-peg diode that generates thousands of tiny random signals a second, technically called noise. They used it as the basis of a kind of electronic coin-tossing machine. With thousands of electronic heads and tails being tossed a second, they could be sure the machine would produce on average the same number of each. The device ran as expected, perfectly randomly. But in the thesis, the student reported strange fluctuations when people tried to affect it mentally. Jahn was skeptical but intrigued.
That separation of the two mean values.
So he recruited research psychologist Brenda Dunn to check the students' findings.
The database.
But again, the random output of the device seemed to be slightly disturbed whenever people tried to influence it by thought alone. Faced with this further set of unexpected results, as a physicist and technologist, Jahn felt unable to ignore the implications.
First of all, the microelectronic noise sources that we use in these experiments are commonly applied in many engineering systems, in aircraft guidance and control systems, in information processing systems, in communication systems. And so the implications would be monumental. Secondly, the effect is not consistent with any of the established scientific models of things, and therefore would be a legitimate anomaly and an indicator that something was wrong, or at least incomplete, with established scientific theory.
Jahn was hooked, and he decided to educate himself about the history of psychic research. He found that over the years, the subject had intrigued a handful of other top scientists: mathematician John Taylor, laser physicist Targ and Puthoff, Nobel laureate Brian Josephson. Before them, parapsychologist J.B. Rhine had done a whole series of apparently successful experiments. And in the 19th century, some leading British physicists claimed to have proved the reality of psychic powers. But all had failed to convince their fellow scientists. He also found mind over matter was known to some of the founding fathers of science, and indeed that earlier still it was almost a commonplace. There arose a tempting thought: might mind over matter be finally proved by the 20th century technology of Robert Jahn?
For millennia, there has been an empirical presumption that human desire has something to do with the way the world works. And there was the intriguing possibility that we were actually going to be able to demonstrate that that was true, and demonstrate it on a laboratory bench in an experiment involving incontrovertible electronic equipment, protocols, and data processing.
So, in 1980, while still Dean of the School of Engineering, Jahn himself took direct command of the project. He began a huge set of experiments designed to be run totally by themselves. He built a new random event generator, now much more sophisticated, its inner workings constantly monitored, and its output automatically logged both on paper and in a computer. A display also kept track of any fluctuations in its behavior. Once he was satisfied the setup was watertight and proof against fraud or tampering, Jahn asked perfectly ordinary people to try and affect it with their minds. What people had to do was arranged by Jahn to be dictated by a built-in computer program. Here it tells the person to aim high. To do that, he must try to make the random events generated by the machine go higher than usual, as it were, produce more heads than tails. The display shows how successful he's being. Jahn designed this so that if the trace went outside the upper or lower lines, it would show the person was appearing to have a significant effect, according to the standard rules of science. The person's task is to affect the output so that at the end of a high run, the trace finishes above the line. Only then could it be counted as significant. Next, the computer orders another run. Now it asks the person to stop trying to affect the device and just allow it to run normally. But he mustn't leave the room. Jahn needed this control run to double-check that the normal output of the random device remained random, running on average neither high nor low, and also that any fluctuations weren't due to people's sheer physical presence. Jahn demanded a total of 150 attempts, with equal numbers of high, low, and control runs to complete the experiment. Jahn got scores of volunteers to test their psychic powers, his lab staff too. He called them operators, all completely anonymous people. With it all run by microelectronics, Jahn could generate and store billions of bits of data to give him the biggest single mind-over-matter experiment in history. Within a few years, Jahn had run over 250,000 trials, and the results seemed impressive. He had what scientists would normally term highly significant data.
Out of this prodigious database, the results are incontrovertible. There are correlations of the output of these machines with the pre-stated intentions of their operators that far exceed any chance expectations. More importantly, there is clear demonstration that the behavior of the machine reflects to some degree the individual operator that is interacting with it, to the extent that we refer to the operator's data as a signature. They are recognizable in their performance on these particular tasks. It is almost as if one were taking an EEG of the operator, but of course, in this case, there is no physical connection between the machine and the operator.
Meanwhile, Jahn had built an even more novel mind-over-matter experiment, a giant pinball machine. From a central hole, 9,000 balls fall randomly through pegs into 19 separate bins. The balls will collect in a predictable distribution around the center bin. But Jahn asked people to use psychokinesis to make the balls fall more to the right or the left. Astonishingly, Jahn found it worked just as well as his microelectronic experiments.
The results from the random mechanical cascade once again indicated that a broad variety of common human beings could achieve results. We find the same scale of effect, signatures among the operators once again. One of the major challenges in this research is the weakness of the effect. We are looking at a few bits per thousand. But that scale of effect is certainly not unusual in modern science. In fact, it is much larger than the scale of effect that is routinely acknowledged in many atomic and nuclear scale experiments, in many statistical processes that go on in conventional science. This would be a very large effect.
But it wasn't conventional science, and that was Jahn's problem. For the last 3 centuries, the progress of science has been based on a rational framework of tried and tested laws. So any research that appears to defy those laws runs the almost inevitable risk of being ignored or completely rejected.
Alongside the mainstream of science, there are these isolated little pools of would-be science. There's telekinesis, clairvoyance, creationism, and astrology, a whole host of pseudosciences. Very often they're indulged in by people with very good scientific credentials. It's quite surprising the foolishness you can find coming out of people who have distinguished careers in science. But they don't go anywhere. They haven't led to anything, and they're not going to.
So when Jahn published his startling results, few scientists took them seriously. Despite his position and his apparently significant data, he was treated like every similar scientist in history. The whole notion of mind over matter was unthinkable heresy.
If there were anything to telekinesis or the other branches of parapsychology, that would really be the discovery of the century. In fact, it would be more than that. It would overturn all the centuries of work and since the birth of modern science at the end of the 16th century. Those centuries of scientific work have given us a picture of nature. We understand why things are the way they are. We understand them in a way that doesn't put human consciousness in any special position. Parapsychology, if there was anything to it, would undo those centuries of effort, and we would be back at the beginning without any real idea of what kind of world this is that we live in.
Now, PsyCop, since its foundation, has been focusing on an area known as the paranormal.
The annual get-together of PsyCop, a group of scientists who actively campaign against pseudoscience, much of which they condemn as fraud. They don't accuse Jahn of that, but their experts have found other, more sophisticated reasons to reject his claims.
Jahn's research involves subjects who are generally unattended by themselves with the equipment. And these are things that worry any research psychologist. You don't have to accuse someone of cheating. All you have to do is to realize that there are all kinds of unconscious ways in many experiments where people can have influences. Now, Professor Jahn will say that he has anticipated all that sort of thing, that it's been eliminated. But when you have the experimenter serving as a subject, one has to be very, very careful to make sure that that experimenter cannot, in some way, obvious or not obvious, influence the data.
They even wonder whether, in a sense, Jahn may have too much data.
When you're doing something like Jahn is doing, where you're using thousands, even millions of data points, we're now in a realm which statistics has never been pushed to before. And it's very likely that a lot of the effects you're getting here could be simply a matter of the fact that the statistical model no longer applies.
Whatever the criticisms, Jahn's conviction in his experiments is unshakable.
The criticisms come in a variety of forms, ranging from inadequacy of experimental control, failure of the equipment, improper data processing, improper statistical analysis, self-delusion, fraud. There are as many forms of criticism as there are critics. The only criticisms we take very seriously are those that appear to be based on some level of information about what we actually do. If a person is unwilling to examine our data and look at the equipment, try the experiments for himself, we really don't spend too much time on the criticism.
But since mind over matter research is considered such heresy, few scientists have actually visited Jahn's laboratory. Those who do, according to Jahn, often come away convinced good science is being done. Psychologist Roger Nelson is one, as is physicist and statistician York Dobbins. Initially skeptical, both were sufficiently impressed and intrigued to jeopardize their careers by joining Jahn and collecting more experimental data.
The data are very convincing indeed. We have been involved in every stage of the experiment, from the design through the operator producing data to the analysis, and we can therefore know literally that there have not been mistakes made, that there can be no fraudulent activity, and so on. So the data to show that there is an effect, the question becomes, where does it come from? How does it work?
Roger has pretty nearly said it all. The effect persists despite 12 years of examining and trying to rule out every conventional artifact that we, or for that matter, anybody who communicates with us, has been able to propose. That's a lot of thought and effort gone into ruling out conventional causes.
Recently, Jahn's team began experiments that look even more impossible to believe. At prearranged times, people have been asked to try and affect the random event machine from great distances. This experiment is from Dallas, Texas, over 1,000 miles away. People have tried it from locations all over the world, but still the machine seemed to show the same mind-over-matter effect. Jahn reported his startling findings at a scientific conference.
The insensitivity of the human-machine interaction data to the...
Perhaps surprisingly, it was allowed to be held at Princeton, his own university.
What now seems to be at issue here is whether somehow raising the ante in increasing the logical improbability of this task, of changing the task from influencing a machine that's a few feet away to a machine that is thousands of miles away.
But no Princeton scientists turned up to listen. In fact, there was virtually no one there from mainstream science.
From Kenya or New Zealand escapes me. Maybe someone else can propose a mechanism for that.
His audience? Other parapsychologists and researchers into UFOs, ley lines, organ energy and reincarnation.
Jahn is typical of many kinds of heretics who go into the paranormal vein of things. They begin by being very mild in their approach, but then they get very upset because their colleagues reject them out of hand. And as a result, you get a polarization phenomena, where they now talk with and only interact with on their wild ideas with people who are wilder than they are themselves. And that pulls them more and more towards the wild side.
Jahn, demoted from dean and shunned by many of his peers, now seems unconcerned about his image. This is his office.
I guess this room expresses my delight at life, interesting things, pretty things, fun. And when I was fortunate enough to bumble into a research topic that kept opening up such new ideas, such challenging ideas as this one did, there was a happiness there too.
And the fact that science has always rejected anyone who takes psychic research seriously, he takes stoically.
My involvement in this subject has opened for me much broader horizons of understanding and insight than I ever hoped to broach. It has also quite obviously brought me into, in some sectors, into loss of credibility and a certain amount of resistance.
What drove him then so knowingly to wreck the crowning years of a successful career?
I think it was J. Robert Oppenheimer, close to the end of his career, who said that there is no man of goodwill who doesn't desire the approval of his colleagues, and I'm no exception to that. But once again, the ultimate judge of your wisdom and integrity must be the person you see in the mirror.
Over the years, Bob's had attacks from lots of different places. His strength of conviction and integrity with regard to doing this work is such that he's always considered it necessary simply to go on.
Also, I think that integrity, in a way, is what drove him into this experimentation. After the initial student project, a great many other scientists might have shut things down. Another man could very easily have said that, well, I know this is all bogus, even though we seem to have results, let's just ignore it. But Bob couldn't fool himself that way. He knew that if there was anything to this, it needed to be investigated.
I'm not sure that Bob sees it as a sacrifice. I think he sees it as a commitment to a quest for knowledge, a quest for understanding. There is a question that has stimulated him and a need to answer it. One way or another, I don't think there's any commitment to what the answer should be ahead of time, but there is a commitment to coming at it in an honest and direct fashion and somehow teasing out the truth from the miasma of anomalies that we're confronted with.
What we're looking at here is a legitimate human-machine anomaly. Absolutely. I mean, the pendulum is doing the same thing virtually throughout its entire 200-swing life.
Jahn, with his small group of supporters, is pushing even further ahead, devising new experiments to try and find the explanation that will finally convince his fellow scientists.
We are a long way from full understanding of the nature of these phenomena. Our best guess at this point is that under certain circumstances, there is a resonance between the information processor that's in the device and the information processor that we carry in our minds. That somehow, at the level of information, there is a sharing that is accountable for these anomalous effects. That's not overturning all of science, that is expanding it. We are asking for another expansion of the scientific model to accommodate the role of consciousness in the way the world works.
In search of the elusive explanation for his findings, Jahn has ventured into the recondite domains of modern physics.
1, 2, 3. There's a covalent bond right there.
In a book written with Brenda Dunn, his constant supporter for 15 years, Jahn has proposed a new theory of mind based on quantum mechanical waves of consciousness. But that's only distanced him further from mainstream science.
It may just be that beyond the cold, analytical, logical dimensions of the human mind, there is a whole other pattern of softer, intuitive, spiritual capabilities that connect it in this wave mechanical way with a universe that also has its own spiritual wave mechanical dimensions. And it is in that interaction, the spiritual part of human consciousness with the spiritual part of the universe, that these anomalies seem to manifest themselves.
Jahn's convinced one day he'll make the final breakthrough, but others may argue that history shows that whatever evidence he might produce, science will never believe it.
I take personal satisfaction in working on something that has been elusive for so long and appearing to make some progress. And I take some pride at being able to nudge along, however so little, our understanding of these archetypal properties of the human mind. The excitement to me is that for the first time we seem to be on the threshold of demonstrating that property in a coldly scientific format, and thereby the barrier between science and spirit that was artificially erected some century or two ago must crumble and come down. One should be able to do research on spirit.
Heretic.